Welcome, everybody. We'll wait for 1 more minute before starting, just to give time for everybody to log in. Okay, I think we can start. Anybody who needs to log in is welcome to join us later. And also, fortunately, this call will be recorded and posted on the Center of Advanced Studies website on YouTube. So welcome all. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you to this session in the seminar series of the Center of Advanced Studies on Southeastern Europe of the University of Rijeka. Today we have a very special guest, Professor Liz David-Barrett. Professor David-Barrett is a professor of governance and integrity in the Department of Politics at the University of Sussex. And she's also the director of the Center for the Study of Corruption of the University of Sussex, which is the oldest and the most, one of the most vocal and important centers, academic centers for the study of corruption in the UK and right now in the world. Liz, her research deals widely with corruption, but also she's leading very much on the policy impact side of the research on corruption. And really, I have to say, it's been a great pleasure to see how under her leadership, the center has become a really very valuable and vocal focal point for evidence-based research and for helping us all understand the intricacies of this complex topic in the UK and globally. Liz also has deep ties with the Southeast European region, because before joining academia, she used to work as a journalist, including for The Economist and the Financial Times, from Zagreb itself. So she was covering Hungary, Croatia, and the whole of Southeastern Europe, especially from a business perspective. So it is especially interesting, I think, to bring her expertise from this bird's eye view on these issues of corruption, and also to bring her in conversation with the activities of the center. And I hope we'll have a very interesting conversation today. The topic of her talk today is rethinking state capture and moving beyond. And it is very timely indeed, considering all that is going on in the UK in the sense and wider. So without further ado, I will give now the floor to Liz for about 30 minutes. And afterwards we can have a Q&A. Feel free to also type in your questions if you wish, or to ask your question live later on. So over to you, Liz.
Great, thanks so much, Tenna, and thank you all for the invitation to be here. It's really nice, actually. It's a pity I'm not there in person, but it's still nice to be kind of in a Croatian environment and interacting with people in the region. So hopefully you can see my screen, and let me just find the slideshow button. Great. So yeah, as Tenna said, I'm going to be talking today about rethinking state capture and moving beyond. And it's a concept that's interesting to me analytically and academically, but also personally, because actually when I was living in Croatia and then writing my PhD about the privatization process in Croatia and Hungary, I was very much interacting with this concept of state capture. So right back in the late 90s and early 2000s. So it's interesting for me now to think, how has this concept changed? Does it still make sense? Is it useful for the kinds of patterns of systemic corruption that we're seeing today? So what I'm going to do today is try to cover these questions. Firstly, why are we talking about state capture again? So a brief history of the concept and where we are now. Secondly, what's special about state capture? So looking at issues around mechanisms and intentions. I'm going to look at a few case studies, but I'm going to touch on, is the UK a captured state, which is a very sort of current debate that we're having in the UK. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we prevent or stop or build back from capture, but that section is mainly questions really, but it would be great to have a discussion about that. So where does this concept come from? Well, I certainly first came across it in that late 90s, early 2000s period. And it was something that Hellman, Jones and Kaufman, who were at the World Bank, coined, particularly to describe the patterns of economic and political transition that they were seeing in parts of the former Soviet Union, particularly in Russia, also to some extent elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe. And they said that it was improper influence over the formation of laws and policy. So they distinguished it in particular from corruption that was about influencing the implementation of those laws and policy. And they called that administrative corruption. And broadly speaking, administrative corruption was these sort of one-off ad hoc acts by individuals who were implementing, maybe taking a bribe for giving you a permit, whereas state capture was happening much earlier in the process. It was about changing the laws, changing the policy frameworks, and it was something that had much longer term implications, because if you changed the laws, then anything you did afterwards seemed to be legal within those laws, and you were not necessarily seen as corrupt afterwards. Now, when they were talking about it and looking at it in Russia, they were seeing it as something that was really driven by business interests. So they were largely talking about oligarchs in the private sector, in the business world, capturing the state assets, and of course, the legal framework. I think that they probably downplayed the role of political leaders at the time, because I think they probably were also quite important in state capture at the time, but in a sense that initial framing focused very much on the sort of businesses capturing the state. But actually other people at the time were saying, actually, this is, it's a lot more of an interdependent relationship between politics and business. So Janine Vadel has a great paper where she talked about institutional nomads. So again, she's looking at Russia, but she says there are a lot of people who are kind of surfing between public and private roles and playing the rules that are associated with the public and private sectors in ways that maximize their private benefits. So they're sort of doing this kind of manipulation and arbitrage. And from my experience of being in Croatia and seeing particularly the privatization process unfold under Tudjman, there seemed again to be a sense that we were looking at tycoons that were benefiting from the privatization process, but they were highly reliant on the conditions that were created by Tudjman and the HDZ at the time, in terms of things around rules around how they did privatization, but also access to easy lending from the state or from state-owned banks. So it already seemed to me to be quite an interactive kind of counter-dependent relationship. So 20 years on, we find a lot of people talking about state capture again. And actually, South Africa has been really instrumental in sort of bringing the concept back onto the agenda, I think, because what we saw in South Africa under Jacob Zuma was this capture where, in particular, two brothers, the Gupta brothers, seemed to be very much in control and able to influence Zuma, and one of these kind of counter-dependent relationships where Zuma gave them access to a lot of state assets, and really seen as quite a classic example of state capture. And in state capture, that process has been identified, stopped, and there's in fact a huge commission of inquiry into state capture, which is inviting in lots of witnesses to give evidence about how that happened. So it's a really interesting case, and it's got us thinking about state capture again. But I think we also see a lot of other leaders around the world who are engaging in a set of practices which seem to fit to a large extent with state capture. So Orban in Hungary, Vučić in Serbia, Erdogan in Turkey, Isabel dos Santos in Angola, Bolsonaro in Brazil. I can't see who I've got under there. Oh, I think it's Rajapaksa from Sri Lanka. Sorry, my thing's in the way on Zoom. Okay, moved it now. So we see lots of these patterns that are being described as state capture, but they're also being described in other ways. So we hear a lot of people talking about kleptocrats, and again describing these same individuals as kleptocrats and kleptocracy as a phenomenon. We hear a lot of people talking about democratic backsliding, particularly in the European examples. I think this is very common to talk about how we were on a process that we thought was an inexorable process towards democratization, and instead in the last 10 years or so there seems to be a lot of backsliding from that. But we've also got people talking about state capture. So I think one thing that we can take from this and from looking at all of these positions and these examples is certainly that modern state capture is more complicated than a simple kind of businesses capturing politics and the political sphere. So the public-private boundary is much more blurred than it used to be, I think. So we have a lot of states that are outsourcing the provision of a lot of public services. They're engaging in public-private partnerships to build big infrastructure, but also often for regulatory purposes. So actually a lot of our anti-money laundering regulation in the UK is basically achieved through a collaboration between the state and banks. So even brought into a regulatory role there. We've got a lot of individuals in the civil service who will spend part of their career in the public sector and part in the private sector. So many different ways in which there's a blurring between public and private boundaries. There's also not necessarily one captor. So I think when Hellman and Kaufman were talking about state capture, they were often able to identify these individuals who seem to be really capturing the state. And I think it's often harder to do that now. So perhaps a focus on the mechanisms or on parties potentially as captors, or particular cliques or groups within parties might make sense. And we can also see that capture, rather than being, again, business capturing politics, is often driven by actors who are inside the state, whether it's politicians or civil servants. And we see that governments are using their control over parliament to push through constitutional change. We're seeing that the party financing is very much tied up with machine politics. So businesses are giving donations to parties. In return, the parties are influencing government, or potentially even directly influencing through themselves appointments to state-owned enterprises and other state agencies. We've got that classic machine politics channel where the government can be giving out contracts to private sector actors and in exchange either for direct personal kickbacks or other kinds of in-kind loyalty or support, like media support, for example, in terms of favourable media influence. So it looks like we've got something that is at the very least much more complex. But again, going back to the institutional nomads concept, people who are able to surf around these different institutions and use them quite instrumentally to maximise their own private gain. So I think that state capture as a concept still adds value. So despite the fact that we've got these other terms that we're using, kleptocracy and democratic backsliding, I think there are three things that are quite useful about state capture as a concept. And the first one is that it really highlights the intentional nature of elite actions to increase their grip on power. One thing that I don't so much like about the democratic backsliding term is that it sounds like it's almost accidental. And of course, if you read into the literature, they are talking about how government actions orchestrate the democratic backsliding. But at the same time, there's something about sliding that sounds to me like it's almost happening unintentionally. So I quite like the fact that with capture, we've really got that sense of intentionality there. Although it does beg interesting questions about intention to do what and whose intention exactly. So do we need to find the sort of one controlling mind behind this, or are we just saying that there's a lot of people acting in certain ways with their own certain agendas, but that's leading to systemic capture? Secondly, I think state capture allows us to focus on the mechanisms through which capture occurs. So we can talk about exactly what's happening, whereas I think the kleptocracy approach focuses a little bit more on the outcomes in terms of stealing. And also because of that stealing aspect, it sometimes means that we're a bit distracted from how the institutions are being shaped with long-term implications for whether you can throw someone out of power, but also how the state is going to operate in the long term. So I quite like the fact that by focusing on capture, we're looking at exactly what is captured, how is the power being expanded into different areas of the state. And then thirdly, it highlights the importance of independent institutions in building resilience against capture. So I think encourages us to think in terms of, well, what can we do to prevent capture? How can we arrest it and reverse it? So what about those mechanisms then? So I want to argue that there are three channels through which capture can occur. And within those channels, there are different mechanisms for a small, narrow interest group to capture the state. So the three channels it goes back to actually to Hellman and Kaufman. So they distinguish between shaping the formation of laws and the implementation, and they called the implementation kind of corruption administrative corruption. But I want to take that and expand on it. So I think that state capture still involves that classic shaping the formation of laws or policy, but it also involves being able to influence the implementers. So although those individual decisions of corruption that occur that are still ad hoc in terms of giving out a permit to someone can be administrative corruption, there's also a sort of prior step, which is around being able to influence the implementers. And state capture these days, I think, often involves using that second channel too. And then thirdly, a really important part of modern capture is about disabling accountability institutions. So it's about saying, look, there are checks and balances on our power, and we're intentionally moving to disable those, weaken them, and hence be less constrained in how we exercise power. So just wanted to talk through those three channels in a little bit more detail. So, the first one, shaping the formation of laws and policy. So the kinds of targets we see here are trying to influence election processes. It's an obvious thing. If you can rig the elections, then of course it's easier for you to get into power and stay in power. The constitution, changing the constitution, again, something that we've seen often democratically elected governments be able to do. So in Hungary, Orban gets a 2/3 majority and he's able to change the constitution. But in many of these examples, we've seen big changes to the constitution in terms of things like changing term limits. So changing the rules about when you can actually be forced out. We often see the military and the police being targets of capture. And again, I think this is quite interesting because if we think back to Weber and theory of the state, then clearly a key function of the state is around securing the territory and having a monopoly over the means of violence. So this is quite an interesting thing that, if you really want to engage in capture, having influence over the military and the police is obviously critical. Then there's strategic economic assets. So, this partly goes back to my early work on privatization. Clearly, privatization is a key opportunity where you can give out control over key economic assets to particular cronies or to yourself. But we also see that in other situations, being able to control the state-owned enterprises, particularly in something like oil and gas in natural resource-rich countries, is a really crucial part of having power over the economy, but also having political power. And of course, the classic having control over the legislature and laws. So partly that can be around the electoral system and what kind of majority you've got, but also what we see is abuse of the legislative process so that there's very little chance for Parliament to have any scrutiny over laws that are coming in. So things being rushed through using all sorts of parliamentary procedure and mechanisms to avoid really having a debate or a discussion or any kind of scrutiny. So that's your first kind of classic channel. The second one, influencing the implementers. So one thing here is around using and abusing the control over budgets. So if you want to steal a lot of money from the state, then the first thing is probably to put more money into certain ministries that you know you're going to be able to control. So those early decisions about how you allocate the budget can be really important. Making appointments to key roles. So again, heads of state-owned enterprises, but also key people in ministries and other state agencies. Public procurement is a classic way of getting money out of the state and influencing the shape of the economy. So of course you want to be able to influence those people who are making procurement decisions, and we see this in various ways in terms of controlling appointments to key agencies that spend a lot of money, but also potentially around the regulators of procurement as well, and appointing friendly people to the procurement regulators, and regulatory decisions themselves. So you're more classic trying to influence the way that regulation is implemented. So not the formation of regulation, which would come under channel 1, but how particular decisions are taken and what criteria are used. And then the third channel is around disabling accountability institutions. So a key check and balance on executive power is the judiciary, of course, with judicial review over government decisions and the final say on how laws are implemented and enforced. So if you can reduce the independence of the judiciary, make those people loyal to you, maybe change the ways that you allocate certain cases to certain judges, as they've been doing in Hungary, then all those things help you to control the judiciary and rip out its teeth as a potential check on your power. Similarly, if you can control the police, but also the prosecutors, then you can affect what cases get taken up, who gets investigated and who doesn't. So that's a really important part of your state capture strategy. And then supreme audit institutions, we know from research that actually this is one of the best institutions for controlling corruption. So again, if you put your own people in there at the top, you strip out their budget, then they can't do much scrutiny of how the civil service is working and how government is operating. And then there are these institutions which are outside the state but play a critical role as checks and balances. So media, civil society organizations, academia. Again, we've seen big crackdowns on civil society space and on the independence of the media in many of the countries that we're talking about. Also in some countries on academia, Turkey most clearly on the clampdown on academia. So all of these kind of things are around, sometimes it's around cutting their funding. So a classic thing is that the government spends a lot on advertising. If you decide that you're going to be strategic about where you allow government advertising to occur in the media, then you can actually reduce the resources of the media massively, or be quite strategic about that. So it doesn't even necessarily involve interfering with regulators all the time, although it sometimes does, but it can be also about controlling this funding. Similarly with civil society organizations, clampdowns on certain kinds of funding from abroad, for example, can really rip out the ability of some organizations to function. So I just wanted to talk very quickly about a few cases which I think are interesting. So I wanted to talk about Brazil and Odebrecht. So I mentioned Brazil earlier in terms of Bolsonaro, but actually going back earlier to all of the corruption that was revealed by the Lava Jato investigation, what we saw there is there was a classic case of machine politics. So the president in Brazil relies heavily on legislative support. And in particular, there's this coalition of political parties, Central, which was really instrumental, and you really needed their support to be able to get anything done. But so in fact, what presidents had been doing in Brazil was allowing Central to control appointments to ministries, state-owned enterprises, and key state agencies. And then those agencies were giving out overpriced state contracts to Odebrecht, a construction company, and Odebrecht in return was paying kickbacks to the politicians and civil servants, and sometimes helping to fund parties. So you had this sort of classic situation which was quite instrumental, but which everybody had an interest in keeping going for various reasons. That was all exposed in the Lava Jato investigation. So we've got fantastic data about how exactly it worked, and a really interesting case because a lot of people were then punished for their role in that, and it led to a massive change in the political makeup in Brazil. A lot of people lost office, and we have a lot of fresh politicians taking their place. So that's a really interesting example. A more recent one, which is sort of happening now, is in Sri Lanka. So there is the family, the Rajapaksa family. One of the family was elected president in 2019, and he then appointed 3 of his brothers and his nephew to key ministerial roles, to the extent that that one family controls nearly a quarter of the state budget. So, pretty explicit and blatant capturing of the state by one particular family. In addition, he's appointed key allies to state-owned enterprises and other key government jobs. And in fact, he's got a military background. So there's also often a military flavor to this as well, that a lot of those allies are military allies. He did the classic kinds of things in terms of removing the constitutional status of the anti-corruption agency, taking away its power to initiate cases. He abolished the National Procurement Commission that regulated procurement, and also the Audit Service Commission. So again, making it easier potentially for them to be engaging in corruption without any checks or constraints. They've also arrested and detained several journalists and activists. Many of them they've been keeping in custody for very long periods now. And at the same time, they're building up links with key media who are supportive. And there's quite a lot of speculation about links in terms of party donations, but also, one key person who was pardoned by the government, whose family members control a key media organization. So again, sort of potentially use of state power to favor someone as part of a kind of favors exchange. And then finally, I wanted to just talk about the UK. So in the last 2-3 weeks, we've had a big scandal in the UK. Essentially, what happened is that the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner found that one Conservative MP had very seriously breached the Code of Conduct, particularly the rule that says you're not allowed to be paid by a company and then lobby on behalf of it. And they found that this one MP had indeed been paid by 2 companies, and he'd then arranged meetings with ministers and regulators to try to support and get decisions changed that would favour that company. So there was quite clear evidence of breaching the Code of Conduct there. And at the point when he would have been sanctioned, he was going to get a 30-day suspension from Parliament. So you might think it's not a huge sanction in any case. But at that point, the government decided that they didn't want this to go ahead. They blocked it. And they said, well, in fact, this whole system of regulating the conduct of MPs is flawed, and we'd like to set up a new committee to completely change the way that's done and review the process. That new committee would have had a Conservative MP chairing it, whereas usually that kind of committee is headed by the opposition. And in fact, they hadn't got any commitment from the other parties, so it would have been entirely dominated by the Conservative Party. So this looked like a really blatant changing the rules, moving the goalpost halfway through, not wanting to have your own party's power constrained. In fact, there was such outrage about it that the government backtracked 24 hours later, and there's a U-turn, and there's now an ongoing debate. It's actually thrown up a whole debate around whether MPs should be allowed to have second jobs and how much they might be engaging in this kind of lobbying. But actually, I think that was just the tip of the iceberg in a way, and that there's been a pattern of these kinds of attacks on accountability institutions under the Johnson administration. So we've had, for example, quite public attacks on judicial decisions where the government hasn't liked them, calling the judiciary enemies of the people. We've had some moves to weaken the judicial review process, to politicise appointments to the judiciary, and even a statement a few weeks ago which said that the government was looking into how it could interfere to change court judgments that it thought were incorrect. So potentially a really big threat to the judiciary. In terms of the media, we've had the government being quite obstructive with certain media. They are really claiming that the BBC is very biased. They are threatening to withdraw funding. They are also with Channel 4, again, a quite sort of independent broadcaster. They've been closing down its funding again and trying to control it. They refuse to put people up on the media often to defend their policies or to be scrutinized. And then most recently, they've been trying to install a political ally as the head of the media regulator. And this is someone who used to be editor of the Daily Mail, that was very supportive of the government, but he in fact was rejected in the first round of interviews as being unappointable by the recruitment committee. The government then decided to rerun the process with a new recruitment committee, and they've changed the terms of the job description and again putting forward the same candidate. So again, you know, not taking the independent system and trying to change the rules. And we've seen again with other regulators that have made decisions, advised government on how to act, and the Prime Minister or the government have failed to act. Failed to start investigations or failed to sanction people who are found to have breached the rules. So I've been worrying about the potential slide into state capture in the UK as well. And that also got me thinking about these three channels. And I thought, to some extent, there seems to be a sort of modular approach to this. So if you do think that these narrow interest groups are engaging in capture, you could in a sense see this as a bit of a strategy space. How do you think about how you're going to do your capture? And you might think about these channels as the sort of potential routes that are open to you, and think about which ones are the easiest, which ones make most sense. And so I think, what you see if you look at the Brazil case is that you've largely got the sort of second channel being used. You've really got a lot of control over public procurement. Sure, that's, then supporting the president and the government's role, but a lot of this is around this second channel here. Similarly, in work looking at Hungary, I've looked at that capture of the procurement process in particular. And one thing that we saw there is that capturing the implementation is really the most important thing, but potentially also the easiest in Hungary because the public procurement law was under an EU directive. So there's not much you can do with that. You can fiddle around a little bit with it, but you can't change it too much. So, maybe going for channel 2 was quite opportunistic, but also makes a lot of sense. Although, of course, there's also, a lot of disabling the accountability institutions in Hungary too. And then thinking about Johnson and thinking about more established democracies, actually, if you wanted to really steal a lot of money from the state in an established democracy, maybe you have to start with the third channel. Because otherwise, if you try to do things through the first and second channel, the third channel are going to get in your way because they are stronger. They are going to be constraints on power. So actually, maybe it makes sense to start with them if they are potentially going to stop you. So I started, thinking about, how can we think about sequencing among these and how different sequencing might suit different countries at different stages of democratic transition or democratization. Okay, so I just wanted to try and think a little bit about preventing capture. And I think if we try and get really abstract about it, we can see the process of capture as, sorry about the dogs barking. We can see the process of capture as involving these different types of actors. So if you look at the picture on the left, I think this is a state that is not captured. I'm just going to explain what I'm doing with all these dots. So I think you've basically got P's and B's, politicians and business people. In politicians, I've got public officials and civil servants as well, and B's on the other side. And essentially what you want to do to avoid capture is keep them separate. They're going to have interactions and relationships with each other, of course, and we would want that to happen. We want business to be able to tell politicians if a policy is really badly affecting them, and politicians to think about whether they need to change the regulatory framework. So fine to have relationships among them, but we want these other actors, who are my aides, the accountability institutions, to be watching what they're doing pretty closely. So to be up close and seeing what they're doing, and to be keeping them apart. So we want some of them in the middle space in there, and that's, could be the Supreme Audit Institution, but also media and civil society. And I think what happens when you've got a captured state is more like the picture on the right. So here, your P's and B's have got so close to each other that in fact they're blurred and they turn into K's, or kleptocrats. So actually they end up being so merged and blurred, or at least a certain interest group of them do, that they are really operating for their own interests, not in the public interest. And there will still be some bits of politics that are not captured, and there will be bits of business that are operating outside this, but really policies being driven by those kleptocrats in the middle. And what you see here is that the accountability institutions have been pushed out to the side. They're not very close to the process, they can't see what's going on, and they definitely can't get in the way and obstruct the process. So in thinking then about how to prevent capture, I think there are a couple of principles. One is to keep politics and business separate as much as you can, and not just separate maybe, but balanced in terms of their power. And the second one is to protect the space, independence and resources of oversight institutions. Now, there's nothing revolutionary about this, but I do think it's just worth thinking about these as really basic principles of keeping the system healthy. And that does present challenges, particularly in a world where, as we've seen, public and private sector are increasingly quite blurred, and there is a lot of potential to encroach on the space of those oversight institutions. So then just finally, how could we stop state capture? So I think the South African case is really interesting to look at. It's pretty remarkable, not just that they stopped this in its tracks, but also that they're having this commission of inquiry into state capture. So in fact, they are really collecting a huge amount of evidence about what happened, who made decisions and how were they able to make those decisions, and getting it all out there for discussion. And I think that's a really exciting move. I haven't had time to delve into it much myself, but there should be a really rich resource there for looking into this and thinking about how this happened. And a couple of things too that I think are important learnings in how they managed to stop this. There were some individuals who stood up against government decisions. So there were a few ministers, a finance minister who in particular said, look, this nuclear power deal that's going ahead, I cannot support this. I think this is an example of corruption. So individuals matter, I think, if they're the right people and they stand up against things. But also the courts were still fairly independent in South Africa, and they managed to overturn a lot of these decisions and reveal what was going on behind them. So it's also a story around, well, actually, you've got to have some kind of independent institutions if you're going to arrest this and capture it. And then I think there's also a question about then what? So even if you manage to arrest the process of capture, it's going to be a really difficult job to build back your state that is resilient to capture. And I know a lot of people are talking about this in Hungary at the moment, thinking, what if the opposition did win in April in the elections in Hungary? Where do you start? And where do you start, particularly knowing that actually Orban is thinking ahead and planning ahead for this, has already created institutional ways of getting a lot of money out of the state and into kind of quasi-educational foundations, which would then have a lot of capacity to spend afterwards. If he did end up being out of power, he could still funnel quite a lot of money out. We've seen yesterday he has had some changes to electoral law around making it less problematic if there's fraud relating to the diaspora vote. So, we know that people who think that they might lose are going to do everything they can to try and expand and consolidate their power. But also then, even if you manage to dislodge them, how do you move on? And I think actually South Africa is really struggling with this at the moment. It's making some good steps in terms of, increasing the importance of whistleblowers. It's got a national anti-corruption plan, but you're still stuck with this really difficult situation where actually what the population mainly cares about is jobs and livelihoods. And doing the kinds of reforms that you need to do to reverse state capture are not necessarily going to suddenly deliver jobs and livelihoods. So one of our problems is that there is this vulnerability of democracy to populist politics, and populists are often using the tools and mechanisms of state capture as soon as they get into power to consolidate their power and make it much more difficult to remove them. So just ending on slightly gloomier, but also some questions, and I think important questions that we could perhaps be thinking about over the next few months. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liz, for this fascinating talk. So I'm going to use my chair privilege to make some comments and ask questions. In the meantime, please do prepare your own questions. So I think you make a really convincing, at least to me, argument that the state capture is a term that we should evaluate as useful to understand many of the issues that are happening today, and that it is high time that we stop conceiving of it as only economy capturing politics, but that in fact politics was always there as one of the actors, and that today's complexity of the world actually opens the space for even other actors, for a multitude of actors to participate in this process. And I liked, well, one of the points that I liked was the one about democratic backsliding not being such a powerful concept. You put it in relation with the intentionality, so of sliding being unintentional, whereas capture being something intentional. And this is spot on. Another thing that I would say is also that with democratic backsliding, we have this sort of normative vision of democracy as being attainable, as this mirage of Western values of a straight line towards democracy, towards the West, towards the EU path, that is very relevant for Southeastern Europe, that eventually has ended up not materializing, as we know, in its form. So I think in that sense, it's more valuable. So I have a few points / questions. One is about, so you very rightly say that state capture and kleptocracy are very often conflated conceptually. This is absolutely true. I mean, I deal with these topics, with kleptocracy especially, and we don't have an answer yet. How do you distinguish them? So I wanted to ask you, what is your answer to that? How would you distinguish these two issues? I mean, here it's the international aspect is quite fundamental. Scholars of kleptocracy, take into account the fact that it's not only a country level corruption that is happening today, but that it is the international financial architecture and this international also uncivil society, as Heather Shaw et al. Call it, that helps these processes of capture, which is also my main qualm actually with the concept of state capture, because it's focused on the state. So I wanted to ask you, how do you distinguish the two? Are kleptocrats, in your view, only the actors that you showed us in your graph? Or is it, a concept of its own merit, in your view? Second, I wanted to throw in the issue of trust and democracy as related to corruption and state capture. So Kanyan makes a really interesting point, also dwelling on earlier work. Saying that, I mean, trust, when we also think in terms of policy making, policymakers often think about trust as very important to curb corruption, because we need to have trust in institutions for them to be able to work and to deliver. And yet, I mean, I really think it's a much more complex relationship that trust and democracy have together, because you also need some mistrust in some of the institutions when they're not carrying out their work properly. And on top of that, I mean, the point that Kanin makes is that in places like the Balkans, you have some informal networks, and those big men that are also typical of African politics, for instance, that are sometimes more trusted than the institutions themselves. And they are more trusted indeed because they provide this redistribution of resources, because they provided that capture. So I wanted to ask, your view on the issue of trust as linked to these problems. And finally, just to bring the topic closer to our institutional home, to Croatia, I wanted to ask you, what happens when reformers become the victims of their own reforms? And I'm asking that in relation to Ivo Sanader. So Ivo Sanader was, to a certain extent, well, one could say a positive personality in Croatian politics insofar as he did spearhead some reforms. And we could, see his downfall partially linked to some of the reforms he has carried out. What do you think? So, in terms of your last point about how do we curb corruption, why should other leaders in other, countries where there is a situation of state capture reform their country if they're going to become victims? How do we incentivize, political leaders to actually be reformers in spite of these developments? So back to you, Liz.
Wow, great questions. So I'll do my best. Yeah, state capture and kleptocracy, how would I distinguish them? So I think that they could both be useful, actually. So I'm not sure that we necessarily need to say one is better than the other. I think it's useful in state capture that it focuses on those internal mechanisms. But I think it's useful about kleptocracy, as you say, that it focuses on the role of other actors. I would say probably that I still think that the process is often driven by the domestic politics. So although clearly there are international networks that are facilitating kleptocracy, lots of lawyers in London, lots of overseas territories, British Virgin Islands and Cayman Islands that are helping people set up companies where you don't know who the owner is. All of that is very much definitely a part of that system, but I don't think they're exactly driving it. So I guess I'm happy with having them both in the case of state capture and kleptocracy, but I think they encourage us to look at slightly different aspects of the problem. And maybe that's something that's useful, and we don't need to rationalize it, but we can just develop them each a little bit more to make them more pointed and more direct tools for looking at what's going on in those different parts of the same problem. Around trust and democracy, yeah, you've completely, I think, identified something that's really important here, that, and we see this a lot also with organized crime groups. Traditionally, people who work on the mafia in Italy have often pointed out that actually the mafia was providing governance services. It was providing partly dispute resolution mechanisms for a state that wasn't doing that and wasn't working. And it was often providing other state services. You see this actually with some terrorist groups. You look at Al-Shabaab in Somalia, often providing a lot of actually public services. So I think there is a real difficult issue here. And in fact, what our problem of modernization is really is being able to build institutions that are making decisions about the allocation of resources according to principles that we've all collectively agreed on around merit or need or those kinds of principles, whereas these institutions are making those decisions according to other principles. And our big challenge is to move from a situation where you've got the extra legal groups providing those resources to one in which you've got legal state groups providing those resources. And I completely agree that that's not necessarily straightforward. And you can see why one one group that is working to provide those kinds of governance services will have a lot of legitimacy actually locally. The question sort of comes when you're moving to bigger communities and more anonymous communities. How do you then make that change? And I think that is also quite relevant. Even things like demographic transition are relevant for that. So if you think about a situation where people had very big families and were relying on big networks, and then you move to a situation where you've got small families and you've got fewer people to rely on, actually you're more interested in having a big state that will make those decisions and make the allocations according to those other principles, because you can't rely so much on your social networks. So I think it's, to some extent, it's something that happens naturally with a kind of developmental and demographic transition, but it's certainly not easy to achieve that. And there's some sort of interactive process where you've obviously got to get a bit of support in the state building people, and then give them a chance to deliver. And once they start to deliver, then it builds up some legitimacy and people are more likely to drop their support for the mafia and go for the state institution. But it's a, I think, complex iterative process. And then reformers becoming the victim of their own reforms. This is a really difficult one, I think. So clearly we see anti-corruption tools being used as a weapon more and more. And so there is always a risk, partly there's a risk that if you stick your neck out and say you're going to go after corruption, you're really inviting people to come and find all of the sleaze in your own backyard, and the decisions that you made before. So that's a clear disincentive to anyone for using anti-corruption. Or it's also something that we see driving people using anti-corruption, actually not for anti-corruption purposes, but just to go after their enemies and the people who were in power previously. So I do think that is a really difficult sell. I think it's somewhere where the international realm can come in. So if you can incentivize people by sort of allowing them to step outside the local political dynamics and get some benefits and rewards and status internationally, then I think that sometimes helps. So if you look at something like, some work I did years ago was about the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And one of the things we found there is, it's an odd initiative because it says, be transparent about all your oil and gas transactions. And the question that we were interested in is, if you're a government that is in an oil and gas rich country, surely you would rather engage in corruption than be transparent about this. Like, why are you going to sign up to this initiative? But it turned out that some reformers were really interested in signing up to that because they thought that personally they could get something out of it and use that international leverage to get other things they wanted. So the finance minister at the time in Nigeria, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, said, okay, I'm going to push through this transparency, but in return, you need to give us this highly indebted poor country status that will allow us to write off some debts. And so she was able to then deliver something for the country, but also that was, big enough and important enough to be able to placate some of the potential opponents to this reform that she wanted to push through. So I think, playing off, there's this great piece about two levels of power, but I think playing off the different levels of power can be an important thing to do.
Thank you very much, Liz. Great answers. So Bernard Casey had a question. Bernard, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, thanks.
Yes, I can hear you.
Two things, and I will keep this very brief. One of which is, this is to the question of shaping legislation and laws, and particularly the question of shaping regulations. Many years ago, and this is in the early 80s, when I was working in Berlin, Wolfgang Streeck and various other people were working on business interest groups and their role. And that was very interesting because what they were looking at in particular, or what struck me as interesting, was the way in which business groups were drawn in, and indeed had to be drawn in, to the shaping of detailed regulations, that we, the government, simply don't have the competence, and therefore the regulation writing gets subcontracted out. I mean, so this predates contracting out of service delivery. And I thought that work was highly important. And if you don't know about it, I can tell you more. There were various people. Win Grant in Warwick was one of the actors, but there were a variety of people in a variety of countries. Sticking with Germany, because I always do under these circumstances as a good German, what one might also want to look at, and is the case of the kind of state capture which occurred in Germany, which allowed people like, or companies like Volkswagen to get away with what it did. The relationship between the car industry and the government there was highly important, and we know what the consequences of that were. And then in my capacity as a student of finance, also, why was it that companies like Wirecard, which crashed out of the DAX index a year or so ago, why were they allowed to be not investigated? And this also had to do with the fact that this was our, sort of high-tech, fintech company. We cannot touch this thing. What were the interests which allowed that, which go into things like the Parliament, into BaFin, the financial regulator? And those are issues which I think, so it's not a problem just of, sort of third world countries, developing countries and things like that. It is very much a problem of, sort of modern, supposedly advanced countries, hence your reference to the UK. But, and here I just stress something which Taina said as well. It is also the way in which those countries facilitate what goes on in the other countries. So it's, the UK as the money launderer par excellence. How is that permitted? Who permits that? What are the interests that are involved? And I think, when Taina put her finger upon that, and we've talked about this over the past, I think that was highly, highly important. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Bernard. So the first question around early 80s Germany. Yeah, I think this is really interesting. So Germany is classically seen as having this corporatist model about how you make public policy, where you've got government in the room, but you've also got business in the room, and they are essentially working together on it. You've also got trade unions. And so, I think partly, this is a system that could work. So just like there's a place for lobbying in any democracy, I think there are real areas where when you're making public policy, there are things that you don't know about how it's going to land and how it's going to impact different groups. And so having a dialogue with business can be really useful, because business can come along and say, oh, you probably haven't thought about this, but actually this is going to completely close down this sector or this market for us. And that's a really useful kind of conversation to have, I think. I think, the point about it is, well, two things. One is balance and one is transparency. So in that corporatist model, the unions are in there as well. So actually you've got the, no?
It's not that. I mean, that is yet another dimension of it, which is interesting. No, what this study, and this was a multi-country study, it looked at business associations. I mean, all the studies which looked at the role of sort of labour unions in cooperative societies, but this looked at business associations and their role in government. And it was the way in which, okay, we legislate on a certain subject. We want, let's say, safety in the chemicals industry or something like that. That was a case in point. Who actually writes the regulations once we decide to begin to have that? And it is that point that the business associations, the labour unions, don't have anything to do with this. And it is the specific writing of the detailed regulations. And I know that this is the case. I've seen this also in financial services, and you made reference to that. But it is how that gets subcontracted out and therefore is in the interest of the producers, who are the only people who appear to have the technical competence to do it. That's what's important.
Yeah,
so
and
I mean, I can write to you later, and I can send you the details of the studies that came out of that. But that was what it was about. It was that kind of capture It wasn't corporatist capture, which is another, it was this very specific business interests. We write the regulations because we're the only people who can do it. And we, the government, defer to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I think this is, partly it is that problem around technical competence that you need, and you just don't get people in government who've got the technical competence for increasingly complex areas that we're regulating. So you see this a lot with tech and financial services as well. I think that basically it's only the people who are in the sector who can keep up with what's happening, and you just can't have public servants who know that. So for that reason, I think it does make sense to allow a dialogue with business, but ideally what you would want is either that's balanced, so you're also hearing from other interest groups that might be affected, like consumers, for example, or also that it's a transparent process. So, one of the important things is, can you see who's met with who and had those meetings or wrote those drafts? Have the drafts been out for public consultation and allowed other people to come in and comment on them? So there are still things I think that you can put in place to have some checks and balances on that system, even though to some extent you are a little bit trapped by not having the technical competence and expertise. In terms of the car industry, particularly in Germany, it is, I think, a tricky thing where you've got a really dominant and successful industry. They do have a lot of power by virtue of that. And there's actually been really interesting investigative journalism work on Hungary recently, which essentially argues that there's a deal between Orbán and Merkel that she won't look too hard at how he's spending EU funds, because quite a lot of those EU funds are going to subsidize German car manufacturers coming to invest in Hungary. So, I'm sure there's a lot of this kind of influence going on. And to an extent, you might think, well, they're obviously an important employer in Hungary, and you might argue that there's an argument for that. But at the same time, how much influence have they got, and does anyone else have a chance to challenge that? And in terms of, Wirecard, I mean, again, I think it's probably a bit of a mix of these things again. So partly around the sort of reification of the tech and fintech industry, that we do tend to do this where we get really excited about the amazing potential of a particular industry, and we don't regulate it very well until something goes horribly wrong. And I think that's partly being blinded in a way by how successful things seem. We saw that with Enron. Everyone was talking for years about how on earth is Enron so incredibly successful, and it's like, oh well, because it's cheating. So there is a certain blindness, but then also that a lot of these industries are, have got people who are in quite close connections to government, and they're pretty savvy actually about trying to influence the regulation there. And then just finally on your point about the role of international actors, I think it's great that we're all looking at this now. So as far as I see it, the international corruption discourse has really changed in the last 10 years. It used to be that it was all seen as, this is a problem in poor countries. And it's now very much the case that everyone's saying, hang on, this is being facilitated, enabled by a lot of companies that are seen as highly respectable in much richer and classically seen as more mature democracies types of country. So at least the discourse has changed now, and I think that's the first step towards actually changing the reality of how policy is made.
Thank you, Liz. Holger, you had a question. You next.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the fascinating talk. So throughout your lecture, I was thinking populism in the sense that populists in power, as you also mentioned in the end, always go to state capture quite quickly. Previously, they can rhetorically, attack the independent powers of media, judiciary, and academia, but then they can do it in a more formal and institutional way. So it seems to me that although state capture usually is meant the infiltration of financial interests, but it can also be the infiltration of ideological interests, perhaps, that they are both private or should be private, and they are, let's say, expanding or colonizing fields of decision-making where they should not legitimately be. Populism has, my question is, sorry, about the public justification of state capture. So populism has a justification, their pseudo-democratic way that they are representing the will of the power. These checks and balances are obstacles. They are limiting the academia, the so-called churches, the fake media, and so on. They are limiting the will of the power, and they are part of the corrupt, insincere, and so on establishment, in contrast to the true, moral, sincere, repressed people. So is there a kleptocratic justification of state capture? Or, I mean, I could imagine they wanting to be behind the scenes, but are there other justifications of what we call right now state capture, with a negative connotation of, that we should do this, we, whoever, should have more power? So yeah, that's my question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So partly your point around infiltration of ideological interests, I'm never sure what to think about this, because it seems to me that ideology is largely used as a cover rather than it being particularly a commitment. And, I think you see that a lot with a lot of the nationalist leaders that we've seen. Actually, this is one of the things that got me interested in corruption was my time in Croatia. And, I was walking around Zagreb seeing Lopovi written everywhere. People were really cross with Tudjman about the privatization process. I was, I was reading all about this crony capitalism and thinking, hang on, this is this party that came to power with basically a sort of make Croatia great again kind of agenda. So how come now they're stripping all the assets and completely destroying the economy? So I'm always a bit skeptical about how much there's real ideology here and how much it's just really useful as a cover. But you're right, there is certainly a public justification of this in terms of being against the establishment, against experts. This is painfully obvious in Brexit. A lot of the rhetoric around Brexit was this sort of anti-expertise kind of justifications. You see it in Hungary, stirring up fear about refugees. More recently, LGBT rights, stirring up this kind of fears and threats, using anything they can grasp at, really, but to make people feel like they want a stronger, more powerful state. So I think, it's definitely a tool that can be used, and we see those kinds of narratives, but I'm not sure that there's actually that much underlying it. How to deal with it, I think, is a really difficult thing, actually. So I'm not sure I've got any answers on that, and I wish I did. But how do you counter that fear, basically? And again, something that's very present, I think, in the Balkans. You can pretty easily stir up fear, even of people that you've been living next door to for the whole of your life. And so, tricky one.
Thank you very much, Holger, for bringing populism into the topic, and thank you, Liz, for the answer. So Stefan had a point about Germany. Stefan, would you like to intervene, to read your question, make a comment, or should I do so? So maybe I'll just read it out then. So he says that hidden party financing by invisible sponsoring is an important problem in Germany. Political financing, transparency, measure and oversight don't cover sponsoring, which is a major shortcoming. So obviously this issue of party financing, which is an important one. I know that in the Sussex Centre for Corruption, there is a researcher, Sam Power, who's dedicated a lot of attention to that in the UK especially. So Liz, do you have any comments to this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I do think this is a really important part of the picture, actually, and a quite fundamental issue to try and fix in terms of, preventing capture. At the same time, it's quite difficult to prescribe anything in terms of an ideal system for regulating party financing. So I think, I've often thought that state financing seems to me like a good idea, at least some kind of state financing. There was a report done by the Committee on Standards in Public Life many years ago in the UK, which recommended more state financing. There's been some interesting research recently that looked at parties in 9 countries and found that those that relied more heavily on private donations were also more likely to hold extremist positions. So potentially, that's something that looks like a good way forward. But actually, there are also, as usual, lots of ways that people get around and manipulate regulations. So you've got some countries that have capped spending in elections. But then you've also got authoritarian regimes that try and abuse that to undermine political opponents and prevent them from spending. The regimes often got the capacity to spend a lot, or at least promote themselves a lot through the government. If you cap spending in elections, then you might really hurt the opposition more than the governing party. And also you've got problems about enforcing them. So again, Nigeria had a cap on spending in 2010, but then it's just had lots and lots of infringements that no one enforces or regulates. So I think it's a really important area. It's a difficult one to get right. And I think, really important to look at the individual political context to try and understand what's going to work in that context and what's likely to go wrong.
So Stefan is in a public space. He cannot voice his comments, so I will give them voice. He says Germany has 50% state financing, the other 50% from private donors is a drop vis-a-vis sponsoring. The USC election watchdog report from last elections will address this more in detail for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic loophole, I think. And another loophole is around these foundations, parties having foundations, and you give the money to the foundation, not the party. Yeah, lots of ways around it.
Indeed. Does anybody else have any further questions or just comments, different perspectives to add in? So if nobody else has any other questions, I mean, I think that one really interesting point about our discussion today is that we have actually been focusing more on so-called developed Western democracies rather than on, democratizing countries or third world countries. And usually we conceive of topics such as state capture, indeed in relation with these countries that are more on the, let's say, developing side of the democratic spectrum. So I wanted to ask Liz about her opinion in that sense. So quite, you mentioned, I think quite rightly, and it's something that I mean, I'm personally happy about, that that research in corruption studies has developed quite a lot in terms of its perspective over the past 10 years, from more quantitative based approach, more focus on perceptions, to something that looks more at the interconnectedness of these topics, that looks at how mechanisms work, that I think also pursues bigger collaboration among various actors. So I think that, that this is a conundrum that is still left unsolved, really. How do we approach this combination of, state capture of grand corruption and the spectrum between democracies and authoritarian countries? Is it okay to speak about state corruption in, fully fledged democracies, or so we call them, and how we should approach methodologically and conceptually its study? Yes, do you have any thoughts on this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think that most of these concepts work across the spectrum. There might be differences in what the precise mechanisms are, but essentially, I don't think that any country is particularly immune to this kind of high-level state state capture or grand corruption, there is quite a lot of resistance to talking about Western democracies in those terms. So that's been really clear to me. Well, first of all, actually with Hungary. So, when Fidesz came to power and those very early moves, I was in the UK at the time and having conversations with people about what was going on. And there was a real reluctance to believe it because Hungary at the time was seen as such a front runner of transition. It was seen as really solidly democratic. What are you talking about? If you're saying this, you're clearly partisan, was the kind of response that you'd get. And obviously there were patterns there which there's quite wide agreement now that those were the early signs, in fact, of something that has been quite systematic and led to quite significant centralization of power and stealing. Similarly, in the UK recently, we've seen all of these moves brewing over the last couple of years. Whenever I've talked about it in terms of state capture or made comparisons with Orban, I've had a lot of pushback, people saying, again, similar kinds of things. Oh, you're clearly partisan. It's like, well, I think that I'm just looking at the mechanisms and spotting the patterns. What about we engage on those terms? But it's really difficult for people to see it in those terms, I think. I'm not sure if it's a kind of complacency or just people very much believing that Western democracies are really solid. I don't think they are very solid at all. It's all pretty fragile. And particularly because, Holger's point around populism, populist politics has really shown how I call it almost like in Star Wars, the Death Star has this one weak spot. And in a way, for me, this is like the weak spot of democracy, that, well, actually, it's pretty easy to convince people to support pretty crazy ideas that are not in their interests by using a lot of populist emotional kind of rhetoric. So I'm not sure if that's answered the question, but I think certainly we can use these tools to look across the board.
Thanks. And I think also technology and the advancements in that sense are probably interesting to look at in this perspective. So Bernard has one last question. Please make it brief. Bernard, over to you.
Okay, this comes back to the international cooperation in this, and one of the things which always interested me is how is it that a country like Liechtenstein, a leftover of the Holy Roman Empire, why is it there? I've been to Liechtenstein, and one of the things that occurred to me is that if you and I want to launder some money, we used to go to Switzerland to do it. But if you were in Switzerland, where did you go to launder your money? So therefore you went to Liechtenstein. And there are things like that which exist and which are not only, they're allowed to exist and they're tolerated in their existence. And this is part of this. How is it possible for these state capturers, these kleptocrats, to manage their resources? Again, I mean, as I say, it's something which came up with Tina, and quite a long time ago, we were talking about Cyprus, which was another case, sort of we've got this rule of British law going on in Cyprus, where a large amount of the money that comes out of the Balkan area is being laundered through. And this kind of thing is permitted, or at the very least understood. I used to work for the OECD for some years, and there were these sort of international tax committees which were sitting, and they kind of were making lists of what was possible. But all this still goes on, and that is a classic facilitator, a sine qua non, because without that you could not do a lot of the things which you've been talking about, which I know Tana has written about, and probably quite a lot of the rest of us in this audience are thoroughly aware of. So when we're acting, it's not a question of just acting within individual countries, it is an international need. And that is something which, I think Tana made a point of when she was writing things about the importance of that, be it at the OECD, be it at the European Union level or somewhere else. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so a couple of points. So one, definitely the globalization aspect of this is really important. The fact that you can pick and choose where you keep your money, which legal system you use for your disputes, even where you're a citizen. This has created a situation where, I think it's best described really by Oliver Bullough in his book Moneyland. Essentially, if you've got money, then you can enter Moneyland, and there aren't really any laws and regulations that apply to you there, because you're so well able to evade them by using different bits of this system, and if you've got enough money to pay people to facilitate that and help. So I definitely think that is a critical part of this. The sort of hope, I think, and the little glimmer of light is that often people want to use systems that do have fairly good rule of law, but they want to use them to their benefit. So a lot of the reason that we get lots of legal disputes being settled in the UK is because people do trust the judicial system. A lot of the reason that so much dirty money is going through London is because people do trust the financial system. And so that means if we could crack that, and if we could use our increased leverage over those kinds of countries, then we could, I think, make a real difference and clamp down on some of this. So I think that's something where you do see a change in standards. As you said, you probably wouldn't necessarily go to Switzerland anymore to launder your money. You'd go somewhere a bit less regulated. So the more that we close down that space, the more we push people into contexts in which they can't be so sure that the legal system is going to work in their favour, and we can sort of gradually encroach on this. But a key thing too is about changing norms, and I think a critical area is changing the norms of those lawyers and accountants and city firms that are doing the facilitating and enabling, and saying to individuals, have you noticed what impact this is having on the world or on populations in countries where kleptocrats are stealing? So I think we need to also work on those people working in those sectors and try and change the norms in those sectors. Ultimately, I think the whole way you win the battle against corruption is probably not going to be through changing laws, it's going to be through changing norms. So we need people who want to do the right thing, and who want to comply with laws rather than just putting in place lots of new laws.
Thank you, Liz. On this great note, to which I don't want to add anything else, because I completely agree with this last formulation as you just said it. I thank you very much once again, Liz, for your great talk and for your insights. And thank you to the audience for their participation and for their great questions. The next.
Thank you, by the way, for the great questions. It was great discussion.
Yes, thank you very much once again. So the seminar series continues, I think, in 2 weeks' time is the next one. And keep following the center on Twitter, and on the webpage, we'll find the announcements for the next talk. Have a great day, and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.